It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian Sterling laughed as he tipped his glass, watching the vintage champagne soak into Elena Vance's shoulder in front of the entire executive board. The liquid felt icy through her silk blouse, a sharp contrast to the heat of the humid morning outside the Ethelgard Tower. The boardroom, a cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the city, went deathly silent. The scent of crisp, expensive citrus and yeast filled the air, clashing with the sterile smell of the boardroom's polished mahogany. "Oops," he said, though his eyes were bright with calculated malice. He didn't offer a napkin. Instead, he handed his empty flute to Sebastian Hart, who stood at his right hand like a well-groomed shadow. "I suppose that's a fitting baptism for the new era, Elena. Out with the old, stained legacy and in with the fresh blood." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't wipe the moisture from her skin. She simply looked at the man she had helped build this $60 billion empire for. She noticed the way his diamond-encrusted watch caught the light, a gift from the board after the last federal contract she had secured. Her hands remained steady, resting on the edge of the table that she had personally commissioned 5 years ago. "Is there a point to this, Julian?" she asked, her voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate against the wood. "The point," he said, leaning forward until she could smell the expensive mint and bourbon on his breath, "is that Ethelgard is evolving. You've been the chief operations architect for a long time. Too long. You're like the plumbing in an old house, essential once, but now just clutter, legacy clutter." Sebastian Hart chuckled, a sharp, grating sound. He adjusted his slim-fit Italian suit, looking every bit the MBA wunderkind he claimed to be. "We've reviewed your core systems, Elena. They're functional, sure, but they're dense. We need something more agile, something I can manage without needing to consult a manual every 5 minutes." Elena glanced toward the end of the table. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, was staring at his tablet, his face a mask of pragmatic indifference. Next to him, Sarah Miller gripped her pen so hard her knuckles were white. Sarah was the only one who knew that the dense systems were the only thing keeping the federal encryption from collapsing, but the head of legal remained silent, her eyes meeting Elena's for a fraction of a second. The trap was already being set, the legal mechanisms clicking into place behind the scenes. "I see," Elena said. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold, brushed steel of an encrypted hardware key. "And I assume my severance has been handled." Julian tossed a single sheet of paper across the table. It didn't even have a folder. "Standard package. Don't look so surprised. You've been paid well for years to sit in that office and play with your servers. Consider this a chance to finally retire and buy some clothes that don't look like they came from a liquidation sale." He gestured to her modest, charcoal gray blazer, now ruined by the alcohol. The board members shifted. A few looked away, embarrassed by the sheer lack of class, but nobody spoke. Julian's power was absolute, or so they believed. He checked his reflection in the glass wall, adjusting his silk tie with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. "Sebastian will be taking over your office by noon," Julian continued, his voice rising for the benefit of the room. "We need someone who understands the future of this company, not someone who's stuck in the foundations." Elena stood up. She was taller than the CEO when she wasn't sitting, a fact that always seemed to make his jaw tighten. She didn't look at the wet silk or the mocking smirk on Sebastian's face. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. "The federal audit is in 48 hours, Marcus," she said calmly. "Are you certain the new blood is ready for the deep layer verification?" The chairman finally looked up, his brow furrowing. Before he could speak, Julian cut him off with a dismissive wave. "The systems are built, Elena. We don't need the architect to keep the lights on. Sebastian has his own team. We're done here." Elena nodded once. She picked up her bag, the weight of the drive feeling like a live wire in her hand. As she turned to leave, she paused, her gaze falling on the massive server status monitor mounted on the wall. The lights were all green, a perfect, humming heartbeat of data that she had spent 15 years perfecting. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice carrying a chilling sweetness. "The systems are built. But you should remember one thing about foundations. He smirked, leaning back in his leather chair and crossing his polished Oxfords on the table. And what's that? If you remove them without knowing what they're holding up, she said, her eyes locking onto his one last time, the whole house tends to come down very, very fast. She walked out of the boardroom, the sound of her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She didn't look back when she heard Julian's boisterous laugh erupt behind her, followed by Sebastian's sycophantic tittering. Once she reached the elevator, she pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over a single icon, a custom-coded app that didn't exist on any commercial store. A text appeared from Sarah Miller. The legal trigger is primed. They have no idea what they just signed. Elena felt a cold, sharp sense of satisfaction bloom in her chest. She looked at her reflection in the polished elevator doors. The champagne stain was a dark mark over her heart, but she didn't mind. It was the last thing Julian Sterling would ever give her, and she was going to make sure it cost him everything he owned. She tapped the screen, sending a single encrypted command. Initiate the blackout protocol. T-minus 48 hours. The elevator doors slid shut, carrying her down as the countdown to Julian's professional execution began. The next morning, the sunlight reflecting off the Ethelgard Tower was blinding, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation Elena Vance felt as she stepped through the revolving doors for the final time. She didn't head for the executive suite. Instead, she walked toward her old office on the floor she had built from a skeletal startup into a $60 billion empire. The sound of a heavy-duty shredder greeted her, a rhythmic, mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. She stopped in the doorway, her hand tightening on the strap of her laptop bag. Julian Sterling was standing over her desk, his tailored Italian suit jacket tossed carelessly over her ergonomic chair. Beside him, Sebastian Hart was leaning against the filing cabinet, scrolling through a tablet with a smirk that felt like a physical oily stain on the room. "You're late for your own funeral, Elena," Julian said without looking up. He picked up a framed photograph from her desk, a picture of the original engineering team on the day they signed their first federal contract. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into a cardboard box labeled trash. The glass cracked against the bottom of the bin. "I'm here for my personal files and the architectural logs," she said, her voice a calm, flat line. Sebastian let out a short, sharp laugh, the smell of his cloying sandalwood cologne reaching her across the room. "The logs! You mean that bloated, legacy clutter you've been hoarding? Don't worry about it. I've already initiated the migration to the heart pulse system. We don't need your prehistoric code holding back Ethelgard's future." Julian finally turned, his eyes tracking the champagne stain still visible on the lapel of the coat she carried. "He's right. I've given Sebastian full administrative override. By noon, your access codes will be digital ghosts. You should be thanking me. You can finally go find a nice, quiet hobby that doesn't involve slowing down my profit margins." Elena didn't flinch. She watched as Julian reached for her 10-year service award, a heavy crystal prism, and used it as a paperweight for a stack of Sebastian's unproven marketing brochures. The arrogance was a tangible weight in the room, thick and suffocating. "I hope the migration goes smoothly, Sebastian," she said softly. "The core architecture is sensitive to unauthorized handshakes." "It's code, Vance, not a Victorian debutante," Sebastian snapped, finally looking up from his tablet. "I've seen your blackout subroutines. They're redundant. I've already flagged them for deletion." A small, predatory spark flickered in Elena's chest. He had seen them, but he hadn't understood them. To an MBA like Sebastian, the code looked like empty space. To the architect who wrote it, those gaps were the only thing holding the entire server's structural integrity together. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from Sarah Miller flashed on the screen. "Chairman Thorne just called an emergency session for the day after tomorrow." Julian told him the new system is 100% operational. He's betting the federal contract on it. "The chairman expects a full demonstration of the new infrastructure on Thursday morning," Elena noted, her eyes shifting to Julian. Julian adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of her window, his posture radiating the unearned confidence of a man who had never actually seen the engine of his own car. Marcus Thorne wants results, and for the first time in 5 years, I'm giving them to him without your constant risk assessments dragging us down. Now, take your box and get out. You're trespassing on Sebastian's office space. Elena walked to the desk. She didn't reach for the box. Instead, she picked up a small, unassuming black USB drive that Sebastian had carelessly pushed aside to make room for his espresso. "One last thing, Julian," she said, pausing at the door. "The federal contract has a zero downtime clause. If the system blinks for even a second during the transition, the penalties are significant." Julian waved a dismissive hand, already turning back to Sebastian to discuss the rebranding of the software she had invented. "The only thing blinking is your career, Elena. Close the door on your way out." She stepped into the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. As she walked toward the elevator, she pulled out her phone and dialed Sarah. "He's doing it," Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold whisper as she stepped into the mirrored car. "He's moving the entire federal database onto Sebastian's shell tonight. He thinks he's deleting my legacy." "And the blackout protocol?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Elena watched her reflection in the polished steel, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "He didn't delete it. He just gave it the one thing it needed to activate, a total system migration. The countdown has 47 hours left, Sarah. Tell Marcus Thorne to bring his lawyers to that demonstration. He's going to want to see exactly what Julian Sterling has done to his company." 2 hours after the heavy oak door of the executive suite had clicked shut, Elena Vance stood in a dimly lit office 3 blocks away from the Ethelgard Tower. The space belonged to a boutique legal firm, and the air here smelled of old parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of a cooling server rack. Sarah Miller sat across from her, the blue light of a dual-monitor setup reflecting in her glasses as she scanned the lines of code Elena had just uploaded. "He's actually doing it," Sarah whispered, her voice a mix of awe and professional disgust. "He's bypassing the federal encryption handshake entirely. Elena, if Julian Sterling executes this migration tonight, he isn't just moving data. He's committing a felony on a national security level." Elena didn't blink. She felt a strange, cold clarity, the kind that comes after the initial shock of betrayal has hardened into a weapon. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming silver USB drive. It was heavy, weighted with the proprietary architecture she had spent 10 years building. This was the Keystone. "He thinks he's deleting my legacy," Elena said, her voice steady. "He thinks he can just swap me out for Sebastian Hart and the system will keep humming. But the blackout protocol is tied to my biometric signature. When he migrates that data to Sebastian's shell, the system will look for me. When it doesn't find me, it won't just stop. It will lock the entire database into a recursive loop that only I can break." A sharp chime interrupted them. On the corner of the desk, Elena's phone vibrated against the glass, a company-wide notification. She swiped the screen. It was an email from Julian, sent to all 5,000 employees of Ethelgard. The subject line read, "A new era of visionary leadership." Elena felt a familiar surge of heat in her chest as she read the text aloud. "After years of stagnant architecture, we are pleased to announce the retirement of Elena Vance. We thank her for her service as we transition to a more agile, modern future under the direction of Sebastian Hart." "Retirement?" Sarah scoffed, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "He's trying to kill your reputation before you even get your personal belongings out of the building." "Let him," Elena said. She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city skyline. In the distance, the Ethelgard logo glowed a predatory crimson atop the skyscraper. "His arrogance is the only thing faster than my code. He's so eager to prove he doesn't need me that he's going to skip the final security audit. He wants to show Marcus Thorne a finished product by Monday morning." Meanwhile, back in the penthouse office of the tower, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of celebration. The clink of heavy crystal Scotch glasses echoed against the marble floors. Julian Sterling leaned back in his Italian leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched a progress bar on the massive wall monitor. 40%, Sebastian Hart noted, tapping a rhythm on the mahogany desk with a gold-plated pen. The federal nodes are accepting the handoff beautifully, Julian. I told you her safety buffers were just fluff to justify her salary. We've increased the transfer speed by 30% just by stripping out her redundant checks. Julian took a long sip of his 30-year-old Macallan, the amber liquid catching the light. Elena was a librarian, Sebastian. She treated data like it was made of glass. She didn't understand that in this business, speed is the only metric that matters to men like Marcus Thorne. By the time the chairman realizes the buffers are gone, we'll already have the next round of federal funding in the bank. He gestured dismissively toward a cardboard box sitting near the door. It contained the few personal items Elena hadn't taken, a small succulent, a framed photo of her graduation from MIT, and a glass award for technical excellence. "Throw that trash out," Julian snapped, his voice dripping with entitled contempt. "I don't want a single reminder of the old way in this office by tomorrow. If she wants her trinkets, she can find them in the loading dock dumpster." Sebastian chuckled, standing up to nudge the box with the toe of his $2,000 loafers. "Consider it done. She really thought she was indispensable. It's almost pathetic, isn't it? Thinking a few lines of code could protect you from a man who owns the servers." "She's a ghost, Sebastian," Julian said, turning his chair back to the window. "And ghosts don't have seats at the board table." Back in the legal suite, Elena watched the countdown on her own screen. 46-12-09. She didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a storm. She turned back to Sarah, who was finishing a series of digital signatures on a mountain of legal injunctions. "Is Marcus Thorne confirmed for the demonstration?" Elena asked. "He'll be there," Sarah confirmed, her expression grimly satisfied. "He thinks he's coming to see the future of Ethelgard. He has no idea he's actually attending a funeral for Julian's career. I've already prepared the brief for the federal auditors. The moment that migration hits 100%, the Keystone activates. Julian won't just lose the contract. He'll lose the company." Elena touched the silver drive one last time before sliding it into the encrypted port on Sarah's desk. This was the final preparation. The trap was set, the bait was Julian's own ego, and the clock was ticking. "He told me I was legacy Clutter," Elena whispered, a cold, sharp smile finally touching her lips. "In 46 hours, Julian Sterling is going to learn exactly what happens when you try to delete the foundation while you're still standing on the roof." She grabbed her coat, the heavy silence of the office punctuated only by the rhythmic, predatory pulse of the server lights. The countdown was no longer just a number. It was a promise. The following afternoon, the air in Ethelgard's central hub felt charged with a static that had nothing to do with the servers. Julian stood at the center of the command floor. His tailored charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the glowing blue arrays of the migration monitors. He was holding court, a flute of vintage champagne in one hand and a laser pointer in the other, gesturing wildly at the progress bars that were crawling toward 95%. The scent of ozone from the cooling units mingled with the expensive, musky cologne he wore, a smell that always seemed to announce his arrival before he even spoke. Sebastian Hart hovered nearby, nodding like a bobblehead at every word his boss uttered. Sebastian had spent the morning branding the new system architecture, which mostly involved slapping the Sterling family crest onto every login screen. He caught Elena's eye as she walked past the glass partitions, offering a smirk that was meant to be sympathetic, but landed as purely condescending. "Ah, the ghost of Christmas past," Julian announced, his voice booming across the polished marble floor. He didn't even look up from the data stream. "Come to watch the future happen without you, Elena Vance. It's all right. Some people are designed to build the stage, and others are born to stand on it." A few of the junior developers chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between their former boss and the man who signed their paychecks. Elena didn't flinch. She stopped just outside the primary server ring, her hands tucked into the pockets of her modest wool coat. She felt the weight of the encrypted keycard in her palm, a cold, hard promise against her skin. "It's an impressive display, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the high-end cooling fans. "But you've always had a talent for the theatrical. I just hope you've spent as much time on the fail-safes as you have on the font sizes." Julian turned then, his eyes flashing with the familiar, jagged edge of his ego. He walked toward her, the rhythmic click of his Italian leather shoes echoing against the glass flooring like a countdown. He stopped inches from her, invading her personal space with the casual entitlement of a man who believed he owned the air she breathed. "Fail-safes are for people who expect to fail," he sneered, leaning in so only she could hear. "Sebastian and I have purged every bit of your legacy clutter. By tomorrow morning, this system won't even remember your name. You're not a founder anymore, Elena. You're just a footnote." He pulled back, flashing a brilliant, performative smile for the benefit of the room. He clapped Sebastian on the shoulder, nearly knocking the younger man off balance. From the far corner of the hub, Marcus Thorne watched the exchange in silence. The chairman wasn't joining the toast. His arms were crossed over his chest, his brow furrowed as he studied the woman who had built the company's backbone. He had seen her under pressure for a decade, through system crashes and hostile takeovers, but he had never seen her this still. It wasn't the stillness of someone who had lost. It was the terrifying, focused calm of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. "I'd be careful," Elena said, her tone almost conversational. "When you delete the foundation of a building while you're standing on the top floor, the view is great right up until the moment gravity takes over." Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound that lacked any real mirth. "Always the drama. Go home, Elena. You're making the winners uncomfortable. We have a $60 billion contract to finalize tomorrow, and I don't want your bitterness staining the carpet." She nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth, a smile he was too blinded by his own reflection to interpret. "You're right. Tomorrow is a big day for Ethelgard. I wouldn't dream of missing it." She turned and walked toward the elevators, the silence of the room closing in behind her. She found Sarah Miller waiting in the lobby, her face pale but her eyes resolute. Sarah held a leather-bound folder to her chest like a shield. "The federal auditors are confirmed for 10 a.m., Sarah whispered as they stepped into the crisp evening air. "And the Keystone is live. The moment Julian initiates the final migration during the press conference, it triggers the audit protocols." Elena looked up at the towering glass monolith of the Ethelgard building, the setting sun reflecting off its surface in a wash of predatory gold. "He thinks he's deleting me," she said, her voice as cold as the rising wind. "He doesn't realize he's just hitting the start button on his own extinction." She climbed into her car, the engine's low growl the only sound in the darkening lot. The countdown had reached the final 12 hours. Julian Sterling wanted a show, and tomorrow, Elena Vance was going to give him the performance of a lifetime. The following morning, the air in the Ethelgard atrium tasted of ozone and expensive espresso. It was barely 8 a.m., but the glass-walled lobby was already a hive of frantic activity. Technicians in black polo shirts scurried across the mezzanine, trailing thick bundles of fiber-optic cables, while a dozen floral designers arranged towering displays of white lilies that smelled cloyingly of a funeral. Elena Vance stood near the center of the chaos, her back to the massive digital countdown clock. She wore a charcoal suit tailored with surgical precision, her only ornament a silver watch that hummed with a discreet, encrypted vibration. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her inner pocket, a small, cold rectangle of metal that felt heavier than a lead bar. "You're still here." The voice was like a serrated blade. Julian Sterling stepped into her line of sight, flanked by two assistants who were struggling to keep up with his predatory stride. He looked impeccable in a midnight blue suit that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He stopped inches from her, his sandalwood cologne thick enough to choke the air. "I thought I made it clear that legacy clutter was to be cleared out by sunrise," he said, his voice carrying just enough to make a nearby group of junior developers turn their heads. He leaned in, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You're like a bad habit, Elena, or a stain that just won't come out of the rug." Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a calm that seemed to irritate him more than an insult would have. "I'm just here to ensure the architecture holds up under the weight of your ambition, Julian. It's a lot of pressure for a system you don't fully understand." He let out a sharp, barking laugh and turned to the man hovering behind him. "Did you hear that, Sebastian? She thinks I don't understand the system I'm about to sell to the federal government for $60 billion. Sebastian Hart stepped forward, adjusting his silk tie with a smirk that mirrored his boss's. The younger man looked like a carbon copy of corporate arrogance, his eyes darting to Elena with visible disdain. "Don't worry, Julian. I've spent the last 6 hours optimizing her old protocols. We've trimmed the fat. The migration will be seamless. It's amazing how much faster things run when you remove all the redundant safety checks." Elena felt a spark of cold satisfaction. "Redundant," she repeated softly. "Is that what you're calling the audit trails?" "I call them bottlenecks," Sebastian snapped. "But I wouldn't expect a chief architect who still uses command line interfaces to understand modern agility. You're done, Elena. Why don't you go find a nice museum to retire in before the cameras start rolling?" Julian patted Sebastian on the shoulder, a gesture of kingly approval. "Leave her, Seb. Some people just don't know when the party is over." He turned back to Elena, his eyes hardening. "If I see you in the front row during the signing, I'll have security escort you out in front of the chairman. Don't test me." He swept past her, his entourage following like a wake of sharks. Elena watched them go, her fingers grazing the watch on her wrist. She tapped a specific sequence on the glass face. A small green light blinked twice. "The ego is a powerful hallucinogen," a voice murmured beside her. Elena turned to see Marcus Thorne standing by a pillar, his arms crossed over his chest. The chairman looked tired, his eyes scanning the room with the weary calculation of a man who saw everything as a liability. He didn't look at Elena directly, but his presence was a shield. "He's confident," Marcus said, his voice low. "The federal auditors are in the VIP lounge. They're expecting a miracle, Elena. If this migration fails, Ethelgard doesn't just lose the contract. We lose the company." "The system is exactly what Julian made it," she replied. "He wanted something fast, flashy, and unencumbered by the past. He's going to get exactly what he asked for." Marcus finally looked at her, his gaze searching. "And where does that leave you?" "In the fine print," she said. By 9:30, the atrium had been transformed into a high-tech stage. 300 invited guests sat in ergonomic chairs, their hushed whispers creating a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the soles of Elena's feet. At the front of the room, a massive mahogany table stood solitary under a single, high-intensity spotlight. On it lay the Titan contract, 600 pages of federal commitment that would cement Julian's legacy. Elena took a seat in the very last row, partially obscured by a camera crane. She saw Sarah Miller slip into the room from the side entrance, clutching a leather folder. Sarah caught her eye and gave a singular, sharp nod. The legal trap was set. The Keystone was live. Julian took the stage at 10:05 to a roar of rehearsed applause. He looked like a god under the lights, his teeth gleaming as he began the presentation. He spoke of new horizons and the death of legacy thinking, punctuating every sentence with a dismissive wave toward the history of the company Elena had built. "Today," Julian projected, his voice booming through the hidden speakers, "we don't just sign a contract, we initiate the final migration. We shed the skin of the old Ethelgard and step into a future where speed is the only currency." He gestured to Sebastian, who was stationed at a sleek glass podium to the left of the stage. Sebastian's fingers flew across a touchscreen, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the interface. On the giant screen behind them, a progress bar appeared. Data migration, 88% complete. "The moment I sign," Julian told the crowd, "the final encryption key will be generated and the federal servers will sync with our new architecture. It is a one-way door to greatness." Elena checked her watch. The countdown on her wrist was at 60 seconds. Julian picked up a heavy gold pen, holding it up for the cameras to see. He looked toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Elena's for a brief, triumphant second. He smiled, a baring of teeth that promised her total obsolescence. "Wait for it," Elena whispered to the empty air. The progress bar hit 94%. Sebastian leaned into the microphone. "System integrity confirmed. All legacy protocols have been successfully bypassed. We are ready for the final handshake." Julian bent over the table, the pen hovering just millimeters above the signature line. The room went so silent that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. He began the first stroke of his name, his face twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated ego. In the VIP lounge, the head federal auditor stood up, his eyes fixed on a tablet that had suddenly begun to flash a frantic, pulsing red. Elena felt her pulse steady. The redundancies Sebastian had deleted weren't just safety checks. They were the load-bearing walls of the entire legal framework. By bypassing them to gain speed, Julian wasn't just migrating data. He was initiating a self-documenting confession of federal compliance fraud. Julian finished the J in his name, his flourish wide and arrogant. He didn't see Marcus Thorne stand up in the front row, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray as he looked at his own phone. He didn't hear the soft click of the doors at the back of the atrium being locked by the federal security detail. He only saw the finish line. He didn't realize he was running off a cliff. Julian Sterling capped the gold fountain pen with a sharp, triumphant click. He looked at the document, then at the massive digital display overhead, where the data migration reached 99%. He didn't notice the silence that had begun to swallow the atrium, nor the way the federal auditors moved with practiced, predatory efficiency toward the VIP dais. He only saw his own name, written in bold, permanent ink, cementing his legacy as the man who modernized Ethelgard. "Done," he announced, his voice booming with a self-assured vibrance. He turned to the crowd, expecting a standing ovation. "The future is officially online." The applause didn't come. Instead, a shrill, rhythmic pulse began to emit from the auditor's tablets. The smell of ozone and heated silicon from the server rack seemed to sharpen, thick enough to taste. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his face no longer gray, but a stony, terrifying mask of frozen rage. He didn't look at the screens, he looked at the man he had once trusted with his $60 billion empire. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Look at the monitor." Julian laughed, a short, dismissive sound that grated against the sudden tension in the room. "The migration is complete, Marcus. Don't tell me you're getting cold feet over a few red status lights." He glanced back at the screen, his smirk widening. Then the red lights didn't just flash, they took over. The migration percentage plummeted to 0, replaced by a scrolling list of federal compliance violations, each one timestamped to the exact second Julian had bypassed the safety protocols. The smug curve of Julian's lips didn't just vanish, it curdled. His skin, once a polished, healthy bronze from expensive weekend retreats, turned a sickly, translucent gray, like wet parchment. His eyes darted frantically toward the screens, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure terror as the red light from the tablets reflected in his gaze. His jaw unhinged slightly, his breath hitching in a series of jagged, audible stutters that betrayed the sudden, violent hammering of his heart against his ribs. The hand that had so arrogantly flourished the pen now shook with such intensity that the gold instrument clattered against the glass table, a tiny, pathetic sound in the sudden vacuum of the room. "What is this?" Julian stammered, his voice jumping an octave. He turned, looking for a scapegoat. His eyes landed on the man standing behind him. "Sebastian, what did you do? You told me the redundancies were unnecessary clutter." Sebastian Hart looked as though he wanted to melt into the expensive Italian carpet. His jaw worked silently, his bravado replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation as he realized his career was ending in real time. He took a step back, physically distancing himself from the man he had enabled. Elena Vance stepped out from the shadow of the server columns. She was calm, her posture straight, her expression as unreadable as the code she had written. In her hand, she held a simple tablet, the screen glowing with the master override key. "He didn't do anything, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "He did exactly what you wanted. He deleted the checks. He bypassed the audits. He gave you the speed you demanded." "Elena," Julian gasped, reaching out as if she were a lifeline. "Fix it. You built this. Revert the migration. Tell them it was a glitch." "It wasn't a glitch," Sarah Miller said, stepping up beside Elena. The head of legal didn't look like a protégé anymore. She looked like a prosecutor. "It was a self-documenting confession. By signing that migration log, Julian, you personally certified that you knowingly bypassed federal safety walls. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as Elena designed it to." The room was a graveyard of ambition. The lead auditor tapped his screen, his expression as clinical as a coroner's. "Mr. Sterling, you are under federal investigation for compliance fraud and the intentional endangerment of national infrastructure. Please step away from the terminal." Julian looked around the room, but the circle of witnesses had already begun to widen. People who had laughed at his jokes minutes ago were now pulling out their phones, recording his collapse. The board members shifted their chairs away from him, a collective, silent rejection. Elena walked to the table and picked up the gold pen he had dropped. She looked at it for a moment, then set it down in front of Marcus. "You called me legacy clutter, Julian," she said, her voice cold and steady. "But a legacy is something you build to last. You just built a prison." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the federal detail lead him away, or to hear the frantic excuses he was already beginning to scream. She turned and walked toward the locked doors, which opened only for her. As the heavy glass panels slid shut behind her, the last thing she heard was the sound of Julian Sterling's voice breaking, calling out for a lawyer who wouldn't be able to save him. 30 minutes had passed since the federal agents had cleared the main hallway, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in their wake. Elena Vance stood at the head of the long mahogany table in the executive boardroom, the same room where she had been dismissed as legacy clutter only weeks before. The air here usually smelled of expensive cedar and ambition, but today it was thick with the scent of Sarah Miller's peppermint tea and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the overworked server cooling systems. Marcus Thorne sat to her right, his fingers tented as he stared at the empty seat at the far end of the table. Sarah sat to her left, her laptop open, the screen reflecting a steady stream of red numbers, the real-time liquidation of Julian Sterling's personal assets. The heavy double doors opened, and 2 security officers led Julian into the room. He wasn't in handcuffs yet, that would come after the formal deposition, but the bravado that had defined him was gone. He looked smaller, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his tailored suit had suddenly become unbearable. Sebastian Hart followed behind them, his face a mask of frantic, sweating desperation. "Sit," Marcus said, his voice a low vibration that brooked no argument. Julian collapsed into the chair. His face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The bronze tan he cultivated so carefully seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a sickly, curdled pallor that made him look 20 years older in a matter of seconds. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his mouth forming a hollow O that let out a faint, wheezing sound with every ragged breath. The veins in his temples throbbed with a frantic, visible pulse, and a fine sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his expensive hair into greasy clumps. His eyes, once bright with the fire of unearned ego, were now wide and bloodshot, darting frantically between the documents and the cold, unyielding faces of the board members. He looked like a man watching his own execution in a mirror, unable to blink or turn away as the blade began its final descent. "This is a mistake," Sebastian stammered, his voice cracking as he looked at Elena. "I was just following Julian's lead. I didn't know he was bypassing the federal encryption protocols. Elena, you know me, I'm a team player." Elena didn't look at him. She didn't have to. She tapped a key on the tablet in front of her, and a series of internal memos filled the massive projector screen on the wall. They were Sebastian's own words, detailing exactly how he intended to scrub the legacy code to hide the technical debt Julian was accruing. "You weren't following, Sebastian," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "You were architecting the fraud, and you did it using the company's own secure servers, thinking Elena's old systems wouldn't log your movements. You forgot who built the house you were trying to burn down." Sebastian's mouth clicked shut. He looked at the screen, then at the floor, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. Julian finally found his voice, though it was a thin, reedy ghost of its former self. "You can't take it all. The offshore accounts, the estate in Greenwich, those are protected." "They were," Elena said, speaking for the first time. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was the liquidation reckoning clause, a specific, hidden rider in the chief operations architect's contract that she had written herself 5 years ago. "But you signed the optimization amendment last month without reading the fine print. You were so eager to strip my authority that you didn't notice the clause that triggers a full personal asset forfeiture in the event of a Tier 1 federal security breach." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Julian. "The board has already voted. We are exercising the clawback. By tomorrow morning, the only thing you'll own is the suit you're wearing, and even that might be contested in the bankruptcy filing." A board member at the end of the table, a woman who had laughed at Julian's jokes for years, pulled her chair back with a loud, screeching protest of wood on carpet. She looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and revulsion, as if he were a specimen under a microscope. 2 other members followed suit, physically distancing themselves from the man who had nearly cost them their fortunes. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Julian reached for the gold pen on the table, his hand shaking so violently that he knocked it to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. "You told me I didn't belong in the new Ethelgard," Elena said, her voice calm and steady, devoid of the anger he expected. "You said I was a relic, but a relic is something that survives. You're just a footnote." She stood up, the movement fluid and precise. Sarah followed, closing her laptop with a definitive snap. Elena looked at Marcus, who gave her a single, respectful nod. The power in the room had shifted so completely that the air seemed to follow her as she moved toward the door. Julian looked up, his eyes glassy and pleading. "Elena, wait. We can talk about this. I can help you fix the systems. I know the investors." Elena stopped at the door, her hand on the cold steel handle. She didn't turn around. "You were right about one thing, Julian. The legacy Clutter had to go. I just didn't tell you that you were the one taking out the trash." She stepped out into the hallway, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her. The last thing she heard before the acoustic seals engaged was the sound of Julian Sterling's head hitting the mahogany table as he finally realized that there was no way back. Elena walked toward the elevators, her footsteps echoing against the marble, already thinking about the lines of code she would have to rewrite to save the company she had built. The reckoning was over, but the reconstruction was just beginning. 6 months later, the air in the executive wing of Ethelgard no longer carried the heavy, suffocating scent of Julian Sterling's expensive mahogany cologne. Instead, it smelled of ozone, fresh rain from the open ventilation system, and the sterile, promising scent of new hardware. Elena Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office, watching the city pulse with a rhythm she finally controlled. The silence here was no longer a weapon used to marginalize her. It was the quiet of a machine running at peak efficiency. The door chided softly, a notification from the haptic interface she had designed herself. Marcus Thorne entered, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the polished slate floor. He didn't offer the patronizing smile he had used during the federal crisis. Now, there was only a wary, profound respect in his eyes. He laid a leather-bound folder on her desk, the final audit of the $60 billion defense contract. "The Pentagon cleared the final phase this morning," he said, his voice lackluster compared to his usual booming authority. "They're calling the new architecture the most secure system in the history of federal procurement. You did it, Elena." She didn't turn around immediately. She let the victory settle, not as a burst of adrenaline, but as a cold, hard fact. I didn't just do it, Marcus. I rebuilt it so it can never be compromised by ego again. The back doors are gone. The legacy clutter has been purged. The mention of Julian's favorite insult made the chairman flinch. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. About the litigation. Sarah Miller sent over the latest briefing from the deposition. I thought you'd want to see it. Elena finally turned, her gaze sweeping over the folder. She didn't need to read it to know the details, but she reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy paper. Sarah had been meticulous. The legal trap Elena had set months ago had snapped shut with mathematical precision. 2 miles away, in a cramped, windowless deposition room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, Julian Sterling sat under the flickering hum of a dying fluorescent bulb. His designer suit, once the armor of a man who believed he was untouchable, was now a size too large, hanging off his narrowed shoulders. He looked at the court reporter, then at the stack of evidence Sarah Miller had systematically laid out before him. "I was the CEO," he stammered, his voice cracking, a pathetic shadow of the man who had once laughed while pouring wine over Elena's hard work. "I relied on the technical experts. If the code failed, that's on the engineering team. That's on her." Sarah didn't even look up from her tablet. She simply tapped a command, and a recording filled the room. Julian's own voice, clear and arrogant, commanding Sebastian Hart to bypass the security protocols Elena had put in place. "You called her legacy clutter in this meeting, Julian," Sarah said, her voice like a scalpel. "And then you signed the authorization to override her safeguards. That's not reliance, that's fraud." Julian's face went a sickly shade of gray, the color of wet ash. His mouth opened, a silent, fish-like gasp, as he realized that every arrogant command he'd ever barked had been logged, time-stamped, and archived by the very system he thought he'd conquered. Sebastian had already turned state's evidence weeks ago, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence, leaving Julian to face the $60 billion liability alone. Back in the quiet of the Ethelgard Tower, Elena closed the folder. The justice was proportional, clinical, and absolute. Julian was losing his estates, his reputation, and his freedom. Sebastian was blacklisted from every firm with a pulse. "Is that enough?" Marcus asked, watching her closely. Elena looked past him toward the hallway. She saw the younger engineers walking by, talking freely, no longer looking over their shoulders. She saw the company she had birthed finally breathing. But then her eyes caught her own reflection in the glass. She looked successful, powerful, and entirely alone. The cost of the war hadn't just been Julian's career. It had been the part of her that used to build things just for the joy of the creation. Now she built things to protect them from people like him. "It's finished," she said softly. She walked out of the office, leaving the chairman standing in the shadows. She made her way down to the sub-basement, to the heart of the server farm. The temperature dropped, the air vibrating with the massive, rhythmic thrum of the data processors. This was her true cathedral. She stood in the dark, the blinking blue lights of the servers reflecting off her face like digital stars. She had won everything, and as she touched the cold steel of the master rack, she realized the sleeping lion didn't need a pride. She had the code, she had the power, and for the first time in her life, she had the silence. It was the most expensive thing she had ever owned.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.